Question 167 of Summa Theologica Secunda Secundae. Treatise on the Cardinal Virtues. The Virtue of Temperance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Summa Theologica Secunda Secundae. Treatise on the Cardinal Virtues. The Virtue of Temperance, by Saint Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Question 167 of Curiosity, in 2 articles. We must next consider curiosity, under which head there are 2 points of inquiry. First, whether the vice of curiosity can regard intellective knowledge. Second, whether it is about sensitive knowledge. First article, whether curiosity can be about intellective knowledge. Objection 1. It would seem that curiosity cannot be about intellective knowledge, because according to the philosopher in Ethics 2:6, there can be no mean and extremes in things which are essentially good. Now, intellective knowledge is essentially good, because man's perfection would seem to consist in his intellect being reduced from potentiality to act, and this is done by the knowledge of truth. For Dionysius says in On the Divine Names 4 that the good of the human soul is to be in accordance with reason, whose perfection consists in knowing the truth. Therefore, the vice of curiosity cannot be about intellective knowledge. Objection 2 further, that which makes man like to God, in which he receives from God, cannot be an evil. Now all abundance of knowledge is from God, according to Ecclesiasticus 1:1. All wisdom is from the Lord God. And Wisdom 7:17. He hath given me the true knowledge of things that are, to know the disposition of the whole world, and the virtues of the elements. Again, by knowing the truth, man is likened to God, since all things are naked and open to his eyes, according to Hebrews 4:13, and the Lord is a God of all knowledge, according to 1 Kings 2:3. Therefore, however abundant knowledge of truth may be, it is not evil, but good. Now the desire of good is not sinful. Therefore, the vice of curiosity cannot be about the intellective knowledge of truth. Objection 3 further, if the vice of curiosity can be about any kind of intellective knowledge, it would be chiefly about the philosophical sciences. But seemingly there is no sin in being intent on them, for Jerome says, in his commentary on Daniel 1:8, those who refused to partake of the king's meat and wine, lest they should be defiled, if they had considered the wisdom and teaching of the Babylonians to be sinful, would never have consented to learn that which was unlawful. And Augustine says in On Christian Doctrine 2:40 that, if the philosophers made any true statements, we must claim them for our own use, as from unjust possessors. Therefore, curiosity about intellective knowledge cannot be sinful. On the contrary, Jerome in his commentary on the letters to the Ephesians 4:17 says, is it not evident that a man who day and night wrestles with the dialectic art, the student of natural science, whose gaze pierces the heavens, walks in vanity of understanding and darkness of mind? Now vanity of understanding and darkness of mind are sinful. Therefore, curiosity about intellective sciences may be sinful. I answer that, as stated above in question 166, Article 2, second reply, studiousness is directly not about knowledge itself, but about the desire and study in the pursuit of knowledge. Now we must judge differently of the knowledge itself of truth, and of the desire and study in the pursuit of the knowledge of truth. For the knowledge of truth, strictly speaking, is good, but it may be evil accidentally, by reason of some results, either because one takes pride in knowing the truth, according to 1 Corinthians 8:1, knowledge puffeth up, or because one uses the knowledge of truth in order to sin. On the other hand, the desire or study in pursuing the knowledge of truth may be right or wrong. First, when one tends by his study to the knowledge of truth as having evil accidentally annexed to it, for instance, those who study to know the truth that they may take pride in their knowledge. Hence Augustine says, in his On the Morals of the Catholic Church and on the Morals of the Manichaeans, 21, some there are who, forsaking virtue, and ignorant of what God is, and of the majesty of that nature which ever remains the same, imagine they are doing something great, if with surpassing curiosity and keenness they explore the whole mass of this body which we call the world. So great a pride is thus begotten, that one would think they dwelt in the very heavens about which they argue. In like manner, those who study to learn something in order to sin are engaged in a sinful study, according to the saying of Jeremiah 9:5. They have taught their tongue to speak lies, they have labored to commit iniquity. Secondly, there may be sin by reason of the appetite or study directed to the learning of truth being itself inordinate, and this in 4 ways. First, when a man is withdrawn by a less profitable study from a study that is an obligation incumbent on him. Hence Jerome says in his letter to Damas, "We see priests forsaking the Gospels and the prophets, reading stage plays, and singing the love songs of pastoral idols." Secondly, when a man studies to learn of one by whom it is unlawful to be taught, as is the case of those who seek to know the future through the demons. This is superstitious curiosity, of which Augustine says in On True Religion, number 4, "Maybe the philosophers were debarred from the faith by their sinful curiosity in seeking knowledge from the demons." Thirdly, when a man desires to know the truth about creatures without referring his knowledge to its due end, namely, the knowledge of God. Hence Augustine says, again in On True Religion, number 29, that in studying creatures, we must not be moved by empty and perishable curiosity, but we should ever mount towards immortal and abiding things. Fourthly, when a man studies to know the truth above the capacity of his own intelligence, since by so doing men easily fall into error, wherefore it is written in Ecclesiasticus 3:22, "Seek not the things that are too high for thee, and search not into things above thy ability. And in many of his works be not curious." And further on, in Ecclesiasticus 3:26, "For the suspicion of them hath deceived many, and hath detained their minds in vanity." Reply to Objection 1. Man's good consists in the knowledge of truth, yet man's sovereign good consists not in the knowledge of any truth, but in the perfect knowledge of the sovereign truth, as the philosopher states in Ethics 10:7 and 8. Hence there may be sin in the knowledge of certain truths, insofar as the desire of such knowledge is not directed in due manner to the knowledge of the sovereign truth, wherein supreme happiness consists. Reply to Objection 2. Although this argument shows that the knowledge of truth is good in itself, this does not prevent a man from misusing the knowledge of truth for an evil purpose, or from desiring the knowledge of truth inordinately, since even the desire for good should be regulated in due manner. Reply to Objection 3. The study of philosophy is in itself lawful and commendable, on account of the truth which the philosophers acquired through God revealing it to them, as stated in Romans 1:19. Since, however, certain philosophers misuse the truth in order to assail the faith, the Apostle says in Colossians 2:8, "Beware lest any man cheat you by philosophy and vain deceit, according to the traditions of men, and not according to Christ." And Dionysius says, in his 7th letter to Polycarp, of certain philosophers that they make an unholy use of divine things against that which is divine, and by divine wisdom strive to destroy the worship of God. Second article. Whether the vice of curiosity is about sensitive knowledge. Objection 1. It would seem that the vice of curiosity is not about sensitive knowledge. For just as some things are known by the sense of sight, so too are some things known by the senses of touch and taste. Now the vice concerned about objects of touch and taste is not curiosity, but lust or gluttony. Therefore, seemingly neither is the vice of curiosity about things known by the sight. Objection 2, further. Curiosity would seem to refer to watching games, wherefore Augustine says in Confession 6:8 that, "When a fall occurred in the fight, a mighty cry of the whole people struck him strongly, and overcome by curiosity, Alpius opened his eyes." But it does not seem to be sinful to watch games, because it gives pleasure on account of the representation, wherein man takes a natural delight, as the philosopher states in his Poetics, number 6. Therefore, the vice of curiosity is not about the knowledge of sensible objects. Objection 3, further. It would seem to pertain to curiosity to inquire into our neighbor's actions, as Bede observes in his commentary on the first letter of John 2:16. Now seemingly it is not a sin to inquire into the actions of others, because according to Ecclesiasticus 17:12, God gave to every one of them commandment concerning his neighbor. Therefore, the vice of curiosity does not regard the knowledge of such like particular sensible objects. On the contrary, Augustine says in On True Religion 38 that concupiscence of the eyes makes men curious. Now, according to Bede, in his commentary on the first letter of John, chapter 2, verse 16, concupiscence of the eyes refers not only to the learning of magic arts, but also to sightseeing and to the discovery and dispraise of our neighbor's faults. And all these are particular objects of sense. Therefore, since concupiscence of the eyes is a sin, even as concupiscence of the flesh and pride of life, which are members of the same division, it seems that the vice of curiosity is about the knowledge of sensible things. I answer that the knowledge of sensible things is directed to two things. For in the first place, both in man and in other animals, it is directed to the upkeep of the body, because by knowledge of this kind, man and other animals avoid what is harmful to them and seek those things that are necessary for the body's sustenance. In the second place, it is directed in a manner special to man to intellective knowledge, whether speculative or practical. Accordingly, to employ study for the purpose of knowing sensible things may be sinful in two ways. First, when the sensitive knowledge is not directed to something useful, but turns man away from some useful consideration. Hence Augustine says in Confessions 10:35, "I go no more to see a dog coursing a hare in the circus, but in the open country, if I happen to be passing, that coursing haply will distract me from some weighty thought, and draw me after it. And unless thou, having made me see my weakness, didst speedily admonish me, I become foolishly dull." Secondly, when the knowledge of sensible things is directed to something harmful, as looking on a woman is directed to lust, Even so, the busy inquiry into other people's actions is directed to detraction. On the other hand, if one be ordinately intent on the knowledge of sensible things by reason of the necessity of sustaining nature, or for the sake of the study of intelligible truth, this studiousness about the knowledge of sensible things is virtuous. Reply to objection 1. Lust and gluttony are about pleasures arising from the use of objects of touch, whereas curiosity is about pleasures arising from the knowledge acquired through the senses. According to Augustine, in his Confessions 1035, it is called concupiscence of the eyes, because the sight is the sense chiefly used for obtaining knowledge, so that all sensible things are said to be seen. And as he says further on, by this it may be more evidently to be discerned wherein pleasure and wherein curiosity is the object of the senses. For pleasure seeketh objects beautiful, melodious, fragrant, savory, soft. But curiosity, for trial's sake, seeketh even the contraries of these, not for the sake of suffering annoyance, but out of the lust of experiment and knowledge. Reply to objection 2. Sight-seeing becomes sinful when it renders a man prone to the vices of lust and cruelty on account of things he sees represented. Hence Chrysostom says that such sights make men adulterers and shameless. Reply to objection 3. One may watch other people's actions or inquire into them with a good intent, either for one's own good, that is, in order to be encouraged to better deeds by the deeds of our neighbor, or for our neighbor's good, that is, in order to correct him if he do anything wrong, according to the rule of charity and the duty of one's position. This is praiseworthy, according to Hebrews 10:24. Consider one another to provoke unto charity and to good works. But to observe our neighbor's faults with the intention of looking down upon them, or of detracting them, or even with no further purpose than that of disturbing them, is sinful. Hence it is written in Proverbs 24:15, Lie not in wait, nor seek after wickedness in the house of the just, nor spoil his rest. End of question 167. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. Question 168 of Summa Theologica Secunda Secundae. Treatise on the Cardinal Virtues. The Virtue of Temperance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Summa Theologica Secunda Secundae. Treatise on the Cardinal Virtues. The Virtue of Temperance. By Saint Thomas Aquinas. Translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Question 168. Of modesty as consisting in the outward movements of the body, in 4 articles. We must next consider modesty as consisting in the outward movements of the body, and under this head there are 4 points of inquiry. First, whether there can be virtue and vice in the outward movements of the body that are done seriously. Second, whether there can be a virtue about playful actions. Third, of the sin consisting in excess of play. Fourth, of the sin consisting in lack of play. First article. Whether any virtue regards the outward movements of the body. Objection 1. It would seem that no virtue regards the outward movements of the body. For every virtue pertains to the spiritual beauty of the soul, according to Psalm 44 verse 14. All the glory of the king's daughter is within. And a gloss adds, namely, in the conscience. Now the movements of the body are not within, but without. Therefore, there can be no virtue about them. Objection 2 further. Virtues are not in us by nature, as the philosopher states in Ethics 2:1. But outward bodily movements are in man by nature, since it is by nature that some are quick and some slow of movement, and the same applies to other differences of outward movements. Therefore, there is no virtue about movements of this kind. Objection 3 further. Every moral virtue is either about actions directed to another person, as justice, or about passions, as temperance and fortitude. Now outward bodily movements are not directed to another person, nor are they passions. Therefore, no virtue is connected with them. Objection 4 further. Study should be applied to all works of virtue as stated above in question 166, Article 1, Objection 1, and in Article 2, First Reply. Now it is censurable to apply study to the ordering of one's outward movements, for Ambrose says, On the Duties of the Clergy 1:18, "A becoming gait is one that reflects the carriage of authority, has the tread of gravity, and the footprint of tranquillity, yet so that there be neither study nor affectation, but natural and artless movement." Therefore, seemingly, there is no virtue about the style of outward movements. On the contrary, the beauty of honesty pertains to virtue. Now the style of outward movements pertains to the beauty of honesty. For Ambrose says, On the Duties of the Clergy 1:18, "The sound of the voice and the gesture of the body are distasteful to me, whether they be unduly soft and nerveless, or coarse and boorish. Let nature be our model. Her reflection is gracefulness of conduct and beauty of honesty." Therefore, there is a virtue about the style of outward movement. I answer that, moral virtue consists in the things pertaining to man being directed by his reason. Now it is manifest that the outward movements of man are dirigible by reason, since the outward members are set in motion at the command of reason. Hence it is evident that there is a moral virtue concerned with the direction of these movements. Now the direction of these movements may be considered from a twofold standpoint. First, in respect of fittingness to the person. Secondly, in respect of fittingness to the externals, whether persons, business, or place. Hence Ambrose says, On the Duties of Clergy 1:18, "Beauty of conduct consists in becoming behavior towards others, according to their sex and person." And this regards the first. As to the second, he adds, "This is the best way to order our behavior. This is the polish becoming to every action." Hence, Andronicus, in his On the Affections, ascribes two things to these outward movements, namely, taste, or natus, which regards what is becoming to the person, wherefore he says that it is the knowledge of what is becoming in movement and behavior, and methodicalness, bona ordinatio, which regards what is becoming to the business in hand and to one's surroundings, wherefore he calls it the practical knowledge of separation, that is, of the distinction of acts. Reply to Objection 1. Outward movements are signs of the inward disposition, according to Ecclesiasticus 19:27. "The attire of the body, and the laughter of the teeth, and the gait of the man show what he is." And Ambrose says that the habit of mind is seen in the gesture of the body, and that the body's movement is an index of the soul. Reply to Objection 2. Although it is from natural disposition that a man is inclined to this or that style of outward movement, nevertheless what is lacking to nature can be supplied by the efforts of reason. Hence Ambrose says, "Let nature guide the movement, and if nature fail in any respect, surely effort will supply the defect." Reply to Objection 3. As stated in the first reply, outward movements are indications of the inward disposition, and this regards chiefly the passions of the soul. Wherefore Ambrose says again that from these things, that is, the outward movements, the man that lies hidden in our hearts is esteemed to be either frivolous, or boastful, or impure, or on the other hand, sedate, steady, pure, and free from blemish. It is moreover from our outward movements that other men form their judgment about us, according to Ecclesiasticus 19:26. A man is known by his look, and a wise man, when thou meetest him, is known by his countenance. Hence moderation of outward movements is directed somewhat to other persons, according to the saying of Augustine in his Rule, as stated in his letter 211. In all your movements let nothing be done to offend the eye of another, but only that which is becoming to the holiness of your state. Wherefore the moderation of outward movements may be reduced to two virtues, which the philosopher mentions in Ethics 4, 6, and 7. For in so far as by outward movements we are directed to other persons, the moderation of our outward movements belongs to friendliness or affability. This regards pleasure or pain which may arise from words or deeds in reference to others with whom a man comes in contact. And insofar as outward movements are signs of our inward disposition, their moderation belongs to the virtue of truthfulness, whereby a man, by word and deed, shows himself to be such as he is inwardly. Reply to Objection 4. It is censurable to study the style of one's outward movements by having recourse to pretense in them, so that they do not agree with one's inward disposition. Nevertheless, it behooves one to study them, so that if they be in any way inordinate, this may be corrected. Hence Ambrose says, "Let them be without artifice, but not without correction." Second article. Whether there can be a virtue about games. Objection 1. It would seem that there cannot be a virtue about games. For Ambrose says in On the Duties of the Clergy 123, "Our Lord said, Woe to you who laugh, for you shall weep. Wherefore, I consider that all, and not only excessive games, should be avoided." Now that which can be done virtuously is not to be avoided altogether. Therefore, there cannot be a virtue about games. Objection 2 further. Virtue is that which God forms in us, without us, as stated above in the Pars Secunda Secundae, question 55, article 4. Now Chrysostom says, "It is not God, but the devil that is the author of fun. Listen to what happened to those who played. The people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play." Therefore, there can be no virtue about games. Objection 3 further. The philosopher says in Ethics 10:6 that playful actions are not directed to something else. But it is requisite of virtue that the agent in choosing should direct his action to something else, as the philosopher states in Ethics 2:4. Therefore, there can be no virtue about games. On the contrary, Augustine says, in his Treatise on Music, 2:15, I pray thee, spare thyself at times, for it becomes a wise man sometimes to relax the high pressure of his intention to work. Now this relaxation of the mind from work consists in playful words or deeds. Therefore it becomes a wise and virtuous man to have recourse to such things at times. Moreover, the philosopher, in Ethics 2:7 and 4:8, assigns to games the virtue of eutrapelia, which we may call pleasantness. I answer that, just as man needs bodily rest for the body's refreshment, because he cannot always be at work, since his power is finite and equal to a certain fixed amount of labor, so too is it with his soul, whose power is also finite and equal to a fixed amount of work. Consequently, when he goes beyond his measure in a certain work, he is oppressed and becomes weary, and all the more, since when the soul works, the body is at work likewise, insofar as the intellective soul employs forces that operate through bodily organs. Now sensible goods are connatural to man, and therefore, when the soul arises above sensibles, through being intent on the operations of reason, there results in consequence a certain weariness of soul, whether the operations with which it is occupied be those of the practical or of the speculative reason. Yet this weariness is greater if the soul be occupied with the work of contemplation, since thereby it is raised higher above sensible things, although perhaps certain outward works of the practical reason entail a greater bodily labor. In either case, however, one man is more soul-wearied than another, according as he is more intensely occupied with works of reason. Now just as weariness of the body is dispelled by resting the body, so weariness of the soul must needs be remedied by resting the soul. And the soul's rest is pleasure, as stated above, in the Pars Secunda Secundae, question 25, article 2, as well as in question 31, article 1, second reply. Consequently, the remedy for weariness of soul must needs consist in the application of some pleasure, by slackening the tension of the reason's study. Thus, in the Conferences of the Fathers, 24:21, it is related of Blessed John the Evangelist, that when some people were scandalized on finding him playing together with his disciples, he is said to have told one of them who carried a bow to shoot an arrow. And when the latter had done this several times, he asked whether he could do it indefinitely, and the man answered that if he continued doing it, the bow would break. Whence the Blessed John drew the inference that in like manner man's mind would break if its tension were never relaxed. Now such like words or deeds wherein nothing further is sought than the soul's delight are called playful or humorous. Hence it is necessary at times to make use of them in order to give rest, as it were, to the soul. This is in agreement with the statement of the philosopher in Ethics 4:8 that, in the intercourse of this life, there is a kind of rest that is associated with games, and consequently it is sometimes necessary to make use of such things. Nevertheless, it would seem that in this matter there are 3 points which require special caution. The first and chief is that the pleasure in question should not be sought in indecent or injurious deeds or words. Wherefore Tully says, in On the Duties of the Clergy, 129, that one kind of joke is discourteous, insolent, scandalous, obscene. Another thing to be observed is that one lose not the balance of one's mind altogether. Hence Ambrose says, we should beware lest, when we seek relaxation of mind, we destroy all that harmony which is the concord of good works, and Tully says that, "Just as we do not allow children to enjoy absolute freedom in their games, but only that which is consistent with good behavior, so our very fun should reflect something of an upright mind." Thirdly, we must be careful, as in all other human actions, to conform ourselves to persons, time, and place, and take due account of other circumstances, so that our fun befit the hour and the man, as Tully says. Now these things are directed according to the rule of reason, and a habit that operates according to reason is virtue. Therefore there can be a virtue about games. The philosopher gives it the name of wittiness, eutrapelia, and a man is said to be pleasant through having a happy turn of mind, whereby he gives his words and deeds a cheerful turn. And inasmuch as this virtue restrains a man from immoderate fun, it is comprised under modesty. Translator's note: eutrapelia is derived from trepein, to turn. Reply to Objection 1. As stated above, fun should fit with business and persons. Wherefore Tully says that when the audience is weary, it will be useful for the speaker to try something novel or amusing, provided that joking be not incompatible with the gravity of the subject. Now the sacred doctrine is concerned with things of the greatest moment, according to Proverbs 8:6. "Hear, for I will speak of great things." Wherefore Ambrose does not altogether exclude fun from human speech, but from the sacred doctrine. Hence he begins by saying, "Although jokes are at times fitting and pleasant, nevertheless they are incompatible with the ecclesiastical rule, since how can we have recourse to things which are not to be found in Holy Writ?" Reply to Objection 2. This saying of Chrysostom refers to the inordinate use of fun, especially by those who make the pleasure of games their end, of whom it is written in Wisdom 15:12, "They have accounted our life a pastime." Against these, Tully says, "We are so begotten by nature that we appear to be made not for play and fun, but rather for hardships and for the occupations of greater gravity and moment." Reply to Objection 3. Playful actions themselves considered in their species are not directed to an end, but the pleasure derived from such actions is directed to the recreation and rest of the soul, and accordingly, if this be done with moderation, it is lawful to make use of fun. Hence Tully says, "It is indeed lawful to make use of play and fun, but in the same way as we have recourse to sleep and other kinds of rest, but only when we have done our duty in grave and serious matters." Third article: Whether there can be sin in the excess of play. Objection 1. It would seem that there cannot be sin in the excess of play. For that which is an excuse for sin is not held to be sinful. Now play is sometimes an excuse for sin, for many things would be grave sins if they were done seriously, whereas if they be done in fun, are either no sin or but slightly sinful. Therefore it seems that there is no sin in excessive play. Objection 2 further. All other vices are reducible to the 7 capital vices, as Gregory states in his commentary on Job 31:17. But excess of play does not seem reducible to any of the capital vices. Therefore, it would not seem to be a sin. Objection 3. Further, comedians especially would seem to exceed in play, since they direct their whole life to playing. Therefore, if excessive play were a sin, all actors would be in a state of sin. Moreover, all those who employ them, as well as those who make them any payment, would sin as accomplices of their sin. But this would seem untrue, for it is related in the lives of the Fathers that this was revealed to blessed Pamphilutius, that a certain jester would be with him in the life to come. On the contrary, a gloss on Proverbs 14:13, "Laughter shall be mingled with sorrow, and mourning taketh hold of the end of joy," remarks, "A mourning that will last forever." Now, there is inordinate laughter and inordinate joy in excessive play. Therefore, there is mortal sin therein, since mortal sin alone is deserving of everlasting mourning. I answer that, in all things dirigible according to reason, the excessive is that which goes beyond, and the deficient is that which falls short of the rule of reason. Now, it has been stated in Article 2 that playful or jesting words or deeds are dirigible according to reason. Wherefore, excessive play is that which goes beyond the rule of reason, and this happens in two ways. First, on account of the very species of the acts employed for the purpose of fun, and this kind of jesting, according to Tully, is stated to be discourteous, insolent, scandalous, and obscene. When, to wit, a man, for the purpose of jesting, employs indecent words or deeds, or such as are injurious to his neighbor, these being of themselves mortal sins. And thus it is evident that excessive play is a mortal sin. Secondly, there may be excess in play through lack of due circumstances, for instance, when people make use of fun at undue times or places, or out of keeping with the matter in hand or persons. This may be sometimes a mortal sin on account of the strong attachment to play, when a man prefers the pleasure he derives therefrom to the love of God, so as to be willing to disobey a commandment of God or of the Church rather than forego such like amusements. Sometimes, however, it is a venial sin, for instance, where a man is not so attached to amusement as to be willing for its sake to do anything in a disobedience to God. Reply to Objection 1. Certain things are sinful on account of the intention alone, because they are done in order to injure someone. Such an intention is excluded by their being done in fun, the intention of which is to please, not to injure. In these cases, fun excuses from sin or diminishes it. Other things, however, are sins according to their species, such as murder, fornication, and the like, and fun is no excuse for these. In fact, they make fun scandalous and obscene. Reply to Objection 2. Excessive play pertains to senseless mirth, which Gregory, in his commentary on Job 31:17, calls a daughter of gluttony. Wherefore it is written in Exodus 32:6, "The people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play." Reply to Objection 3. As stated in Article 2, play is necessary for the intercourse of human life. Now, whatever is useful to human intercourse may have a lawful employment ascribed to it, wherefore the occupation of play-actors, the object of which is to cheer the heart of man, is not unlawful in itself, nor are they in a state of sin provided that their playing be moderated, namely, that they use no unlawful words or deeds in order to amuse, and that they do not introduce play into undue matters and seasons. And although in human affairs they have no other occupation in reference to other men, nevertheless in reference to themselves and to God, they perform other actions both serious and virtuous, such as prayer and the moderation of their own passions and operations, while sometimes they give alms to the poor. Wherefore those who maintain them in moderation do not sin, but act justly, by rewarding them for their services. On the other hand, if a man spends too much on such persons, or maintains those comedians who practice unlawful mirth, he sins as encouraging them in their sin. Hence Augustine says that to give one's property to comedians is a great sin, not a virtue. Unless by chance some play actor were in extreme need, in which case one would have to assist him. For Ambrose says, "Feed him that dies of hunger, for whenever thou canst save a man by feeding him, if thou hast not fed him, thou hast slain him." Fourth Article. Whether there is a sin in lack of mirth. Objection 1. It would seem that there is no sin in lack of mirth, for no sin is prescribed to a penitent. But Augustine, speaking of a penitent, says, "Let him refrain from games and the sights of the world, if he wishes to obtain the grace of a full pardon." Therefore, there is no sin in lack of mirth. Objection 2. Further, no sin is included in the praise given to holy men. But some persons are praised for having refrained from mirth, for it is written in Jeremiah 15:17, "I sat not in the assembly of jesters," and in Tobias 3:17, "Never have I joined myself with them that play, neither have I made myself partaker with them that walk in lightness." Therefore, there can be no sin in the lack of mirth. Objection 3. Further, Andronicus counts austerity to be one of the virtues, and he describes it as a habit whereby a man neither gives nor receives the pleasures of conversation. Now this pertains to the lack of mirth. Therefore, the lack of mirth is virtuous rather than sinful. On the contrary, the philosopher, in Ethics 2:7 and Ethics 4:8, reckons the lack of mirth to be a vice. I answer that, in human affairs, whatever is against reason is a sin. Now it is against reason for a man to be burdensome to others, by offering no pleasure to others, and by hindering their enjoyment. Wherefore Seneca says, "Let your conduct be guided by wisdom, so that no one will think you rude, or despise you as a cad." Now a man who is without mirth is not only lacking in playful speech, but is also burdensome to others, since he is deaf to the moderate mirth of others. Consequently, they are vicious, and are said to be boorish or rude, as the philosopher states in Ethics 4:8. Since, however, mirth is useful for the sake of the rest and pleasure it affords, and since in human life pleasure and rest are not in quest for their own sake, but for the sake of operation, as stated in Ethics 10:6, it follows that lack of mirth is less sinful than excess thereof. Hence the philosopher says in Ethics 9:10, "We should make few friends for the sake of pleasure, since but little sweetness suffices to season life, just as little salt suffices for our meat." Reply to Objection 1. Mirth is forbidden the penitent, because he is called upon to mourn for his sins. Nor does this imply a vice in default, because this very diminishment of mirth in them is in accordance with reason. Reply to Objection 2. Jeremiah speaks there in accordance with the times, the state of which required that man should mourn, wherefore he adds, "I sat alone, because thou hast filled me with threats." The words of Tobias 3 refer to excessive mirth, and this is evident from his adding, "Neither have I made myself partaker with them that walk in lightness." Reply to Objection 3. Austerity, as a virtue, does not exclude all pleasures, but only such as are excessive and inordinate. Wherefore it would seem to pertain to affability, which the philosopher, in Ethics 4:6, calls friendliness, or eutrapelia, otherwise wittiness. Nevertheless, he names and defines it thus in respect of its agreement with temperance, to which it belongs to restrain pleasure. End of question 168. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. Question 169 of Summa Theologica Secunda Secundae. Treatise on the Cardinal Virtues. The Virtue of Temperance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Summa Theologica Secunda Secundae. Treatise on the Cardinal Virtues. The Virtue of Temperance, by Saint Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Question 169, of modesty in the outward apparel, in 2 articles. We must now consider modesty as connected with the outward apparel, and under this head there are 2 points of inquiry. First, whether there can be virtue and vice in connection with outward apparel. Second, whether women sin mortally by excessive adornment. First article, whether there can be virtue and vice in connection with outward apparel. Objection 1. It would seem that there cannot be virtue and vice in connection with outward apparel. For outward adornment does not belong to us by nature, wherefore it varies according to different times and places. Hence Augustine says in On Christian Doctrine 3:12 that, "Among the ancient Romans it was scandalous for one to wear a cloak with sleeves and reaching to the ankles, whereas now it is scandalous for anyone hailing from a reputable place to be without them." Now according to the philosopher in Ethics 2:1, there is in us a natural aptitude for the virtues. Therefore, there is no virtue or vice about such things. Objection 2, further, if there were virtue and vice in connection with outward attire, excess in this matter would be sinful. Now excess in outward attire is not apparently sinful, since even the ministers of the altar use most precious vestments in the sacred ministry. Likewise, it would not seem to be sinful to be lacking in this, for it is said in praise of certain people, in Hebrews 11:37, "They wandered about in sheepskins and in goatskins." Therefore, it seems that there cannot be virtue and vice in this matter. Objection 3, further, every virtue is either theological or moral or intellectual. Now an intellectual virtue is not conversant with matter of this kind, since it is a perfection regarding the knowledge of truth. Nor is there a theological virtue connected therewith, since that has God for its object. Nor are any of the moral virtues enumerated by the philosopher in Ethics 2:7 connected with it. Therefore, it seems that there cannot be virtue and vice in connection with this kind of attire. On the contrary, honesty pertains to virtue. Now a certain honesty is observed in the outward apparel. For Ambrose says, in On the Duties of the Clergy 1:19, "The body should be bedecked naturally and without affectation, with simplicity, with negligence rather than nicety, not with costly and dazzling apparel, but with ordinary clothes, so that nothing be lacking to honesty and necessity, yet nothing be added to increase its beauty." Therefore, there can be virtue and vice in the outward attire. I answer that, It is not in the outward things themselves which man uses that there is vice, but on the part of man who uses them immoderately. This lack of moderation occurs in two ways. First, in comparison with the customs of those among whom one lives. Wherefore Augustine says, in Confessions 3:8, "Those offenses which are contrary to the customs of men are to be avoided according to the customs generally prevailing, so that a thing agreed upon and confirmed by custom or law of any city or nation may not be violated at the lawless pleasure of any, whether citizen or foreigner. For any part which harmonizeth not with its whole is offensive." Secondly, the lack of moderation in the use of these things may arise from the inordinate attachment of the user, the result being that a man sometimes takes too much pleasure in using them, either in accordance with the custom of those among whom he dwells, or contrary to such custom. Hence Augustine says, in On Christian Doctrine 3:12, "We must avoid excessive pleasure in the use of things, for it leads not only wickedly to abuse the customs of those among whom we dwell, but frequently to exceed their bounds, so that, whereas it lay hidden, while under the restraint of established morality, it displays its deformity in a most lawless outbreak." In point of excess, this inordinate attachment occurs in three ways. First, when a man seeks glory from excessive attention to dress, insofar as dress and such like things are a kind of ornament. Hence Gregory says, in his Homily 40 on the Gospel, "There are some who think that attention to finery and costly dress is no sin. Surely, if this were no fault, the Word of God would not say so expressly that the rich man who was tortured in hell had been clothed in purple and fine linen. No one, forsooth, seeks costly apparel, such namely as exceeds his estate, save for vainglory." Secondly, when a man seeks sensuous pleasure from excessive attention to dress, insofar as dress is directed to the body's comfort. Thirdly, when a man is too solicitous in his attention to outward apparel. Accordingly, Andronicus reckons three virtues in connection with outward attire, namely, humility, which excludes the seeking of glory, wherefore he says that humility is the habit avoiding excessive expenditure and parade; contentment, which excludes the seeking of sensuous pleasure, wherefore he says that contentedness is the habit that makes a man satisfied with what is suitable, and enables him to determine what is becoming in his manner of life. According to the saying of the Apostle in 1 Timothy 6:8, "Having food wherewith to be covered, with these let us be content." And simplicity, which excludes excessive solicitude about such things, wherefore he says that simplicity is a habit that makes a man contented with what he has. In the point of deficiency, there may be inordinate attachment in two ways. First, through a man's neglect to give the requisite study or trouble to the use of outward apparel. Wherefore the philosopher says in Ethics 7:7 that it is a mark of effeminacy to let one's cloak trail on the ground to avoid the trouble of lifting it up. Secondly, by seeking glory from the very lack of attention to outward attire. Hence Augustine says, in his commentary on the Sermon of the Mount 2:12, that not only the glare and pomp of outward things, but even dirt and the weeds of mourning may be a subject of ostentation, all the more dangerous as being a decoy under the guise of God's service. And the philosopher says, in Ethics 4:7, that both excess and inordinate defect are a subject of ostentation. Reply to Objection 1. Although outward attire does not come from nature, it belongs to natural reason to moderate it. so that we are naturally inclined to be the recipients of the virtue that moderates outward raiment. Reply to Obj. 2. Those who are placed in a position of dignity, or again the ministers of the altar, are attired in more costly apparel than others, not for the sake of their own glory, but to indicate the excellence of their office or of the divine worship. Wherefore this is not sinful in them. Hence Augustine says in On Christian Doctrine 3:12, "Whoever uses outward things in such a way as to exceed the bounds observed by the good people among whom he dwells, either signifies something by so doing, or is guilty of sin, inasmuch as he uses these things for sensual pleasure or ostentation." Likewise, there may be sin on the part of deficiency, although it is not always a sin to wear coarser clothes than other people. For if this be done through ostentation or pride, in order to set oneself above others, it is sin of superstition. Whereas, if this be done to tame the flesh or to humble the spirit, it belongs to the virtue of temperance. Hence Augustine says, in On Christian Doctrine 3:12, "Whoever uses transitory things with greater restraint than is customary with those among whom he dwells is either temperate or superstitious." Especially, however, is the use of coarse raiment befitting to those who by word and example urge others to repentance, as did the prophets of whom the apostle is speaking in the passage quoted. Wherefore a gloss on Matthew 3:4 says, "He who preaches penance wears the garb of penance." Reply to Obj. 3. This outward apparel is an indication of man's estate, wherefore excess, deficiency, and mean therein are referable to the virtue of truthfulness, which the philosopher in Ethics 2:7 assigns to deeds and words, which are indications of something connected with man's estate. Second article: Whether the adornment of women is devoid of mortal sin. Objection 1. It would seem that the adornment of women is not devoid of mortal sin. For whatever is contrary to a precept of the divine law is a mortal sin. Now the adornment of women is contrary to a precept of the divine law, for it is written in 1 Peter 3:3, "Whose, namely a woman's, adorning, let it not be the outward plaiting of the hair, or the wearing of gold, or the putting on of apparel." Wherefore a gloss of Cyprian says, "Those who are clothed in silk and purple cannot sincerely put on Christ. Those who are bedecked with gold and pearls and trinkets have forfeited the adornments of mind and body." Now this is not done without mortal sin. Therefore, the adornment of women cannot be devoid of mortal sin. Objection 2 further. Cyprian says, "I hold that not only virgins and widows, but also wives and all women without exception, should be admonished that nowise should they deface God's work and fabric, the clay that he hath fashioned, with the aid of yellow pigments, black powders, or rouge, or by applying any dye that alters the natural features." And afterwards he adds, "They lay hands on God when they strive to reform what he has formed. This is an assault on the divine handiwork, a distortion of the truth. Thou shalt not be able to see God, having no longer the eyes that God made, but those the devil has unmade. With him shalt thou burn on whose account thou art bedecked." But this is not due except to mortal sin. Therefore, the adornment of women is not devoid of mortal sin. Objection 3 further. Just as it is unbecoming for a woman to wear man's clothes, so it is unbecoming for her to adorn herself inordinately. Now the former is a sin, for it is written in Deuteronomy 22:5, "A woman shall not be clothed with man's apparel, neither shall a man use woman's apparel. Therefore, it seems that also the excessive adornment of woman is a mortal sin. On the contrary, if this were true, it would seem that the makers of these means of adornment sin mortally. I answer that, as regards the adornment of women, we must bear in mind the general statements made above in Article 1 concerning outward apparel, and also something special, namely that a woman's apparel may incite men to lust, according to Proverbs 7:10. Behold, a woman meeteth him in harlot's attire, prepared to deceive souls. Nevertheless, a woman may use means to please her husband, lest through despising her he fall into adultery. Hence it is written in 1 Corinthians 7:34 that the woman that is married thinketh on the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Wherefore, if a married woman adorn herself in order to please her husband, she can do this without sin. But those women who have no husband nor wish to have one, or who are in a state of life inconsistent with marriage, cannot without sin desire to give lustful pleasure to those men who see them, because this is to incite them to sin. And if indeed they adorn themselves with this intention of provoking others to lust, they sin mortally, whereas if they do so from frivolity or from vanity for the sake of ostentation, it is not always mortal, but sometimes venial. And the same applies to men in this respect. Hence Augustine says in his letter 245, I do not wish you to be hasty in forbidding the wearing of gold or costly attire, except in the case of those who, being neither married nor wishful to marry, should think how they may please God, whereas the others think on the things of the world, either husbands, how they may please their wives, or wives, how they may please their husbands. Except that it is unbecoming for women, though married, to uncover their hair, since the Apostle commands them to cover their head. Yet in this case some might be excused from sin, when they do this not through vanity, but on account of some contrary custom, although such a custom is not to be commended. Reply to Objection 1. Asaglas says on this passage, The wives of those who were in distress despised their husbands, and decked themselves that they might please other men. And the Apostle forbids this. Cyprian is speaking in the same sense, yet he does not forbid married women to adorn themselves in order to please their husbands, lest the latter be afforded an occasion of sin with other women. Hence the Apostle says in 1 Timothy 2:9, Women, in ornate apparel, adorning themselves with modesty and sobriety, not with plaited hair or gold or pearls or costly attire. Whence we are given to understand that women are not forbidden to adorn themselves soberly and moderately, but to do so excessively, shamelessly, and immodestly. Reply to Objection 2. Cyprian is speaking of women painting themselves. This is a kind of falsification which cannot be devoid of sin. Wherefore Augustine says in his letter 245, To dye oneself with paints in order to have a rosier or paler complexion is a lying counterfeit. I doubt whether even their husbands are willing to be deceived by it, by whom alone, that is, the husbands, are they to be permitted, but not ordered, to adorn themselves. However, such painting does not always involve a mortal sin, but only when it is done for the sake of sensuous pleasure or in contempt of God, and it is to like cases that Cyprian refers. It must, however, be observed that it is one thing to counterfeit a beauty one has not, and another to hide a disfigurement arising from some cause such as sickness or the like. For this is lawful, since according to the Apostle in 1 Corinthians 12:23, Such as we think to be the less honorable members of the body, about these we put more abundant honor. Reply to Objection 3. As stated in the foregoing article, outward apparel should be consistent with the estate of the person, according to the general custom. Hence, it is in itself sinful for a woman to wear man's clothes, or vice versa, especially since this may be a cause of sensuous pleasure, and it is expressly forbidden in the law in Deuteronomy 22, because the Gentiles used to practice this change of attire for the purpose of idolatrous superstition. Nevertheless, this may be done sometimes without sin on account of some necessity, either in order to hide oneself from one's enemies, or through lack of other clothes, or for some other similar motive. Reply to Objection 4. In the case of an art directed to the production of goods which men cannot use without sin, it follows that the workmen sin in making such things as directly affording others an occasion for sin. For instance, if a man were to make idols or anything pertaining to idolatrous worship. But in the case of an art, the products of which may be employed by man either for a good or for an evil use, such as swords, arrows, and the like, the practice of such an art is not sinful. These alone should be called arts, wherefore Chrysostom says, in his 44th homily on the Gospel of Matthew, "The name of art should be applied to those only which contribute towards and produce necessaries and mainstays of life." In the case of an art that produces things which for the most part some people put to an evil use, although such arts are not unlawful in themselves, nevertheless, according to the teaching of Plato, they should be extirpated from the state by the governing authority. Accordingly, since women may lawfully adorn themselves, whether to maintain the fitness of their estate, or even by adding something thereto, in order to please their husbands, it follows that those who make such means of adornment do not sin in the practice of their art, except perhaps by inventing means that are superfluous and fantastic. Hence Chrysostom says that even the shoemakers' and clothiers' arts stand in need of restraint, for they have lent their art to lust by abusing its needs and debasing art by art. End of question 169. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. Question 170 of Summa Theologica Secunda Secundae. Treatise on the Cardinal Virtues. The Virtue of Temperance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Summa Theologica Secunda Secundae. Treatise on the Cardinal Virtues. The Virtue of Temperance. By Saint Thomas Aquinas. Translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Question 170. Of the Precepts of Temperance, in 2 articles. We must next consider the precepts of temperance. First, the precepts of temperance itself. Second, the precepts of its parts. First article. Whether the precepts of temperance are suitably given in the divine law. Objection 1. It would seem that the precepts of temperance are unsuitably given in the divine law, because fortitude is a greater virtue than temperance, as stated above in question 123, Article 12, and question 141, Article 8. Now there is no precept of fortitude among the precepts of the Decalogue, which are the most important among the precepts of the law. Therefore, it was unfitting to include among the precepts of the Decalogue the prohibition of adultery, which is contrary to temperance, as stated above in question 154, Articles 1 and 8. Objection 2, further. Temperance is not only about venereal matters, but also about pleasures of meat and drink. Now the precepts of the Decalogue include no prohibition of a vice pertaining to pleasures of meat and drink, or to any other species of lust. Neither, therefore, should they include a precept prohibiting adultery, which pertains to venereal pleasure. Objection 3 further. In the lawgiver's intention, inducement to virtue precedes the prohibition of vice, since vices are forbidden in order that obstacles to virtue may be removed. Now the precepts of the Decalogue are the most important in the divine law. Therefore, the precepts of the Decalogue should have included an affirmative precept directly prescribing the virtue of temperance, rather than a negative precept forbidding adultery, which is directly opposed thereto. On the contrary, stands the authority of Scripture in the Decalogue. Confer Exodus chapter 20, verses 14 through 17. I answer that, as the Apostle says in 1 Timothy 1:5, "The end of the commandment is charity, which is enjoined upon us in the true precepts concerning the love of God and of our neighbor." Wherefore, the Decalogue contains those precepts which tend more directly to the love of God and of our neighbor. Now among the vices opposed to temperance, adultery would seem most of all opposed to the love of our neighbor, since thereby a man lays hold of another's property for his own use, by abusing his neighbor's wife. Wherefore the precepts of the Decalogue include a special prohibition of adultery, not only as committed in deed, but also as desired in thought. Reply to Objection 1. Among the species of vices opposed to fortitude, there is not one that is so directly opposed to the love of our neighbor as adultery, which is a species of lust that is opposed to temperance. And yet the vice of daring, which is opposed to fortitude, is wont to be sometimes the cause of murder, which is forbidden by one of the precepts of the Decalogue. For it is written in Ecclesiasticus 8:18, "Go not on the way with a bold man, lest he burden thee with his evils." Reply to Objection 2. Gluttony is not directly opposed to the love of our neighbor, as adultery is. Nor indeed is any other species of lust, for a father is not so wronged by the seduction of the virgin over whom he has no connubial right, as is the husband by the adultery of his wife. For he, not the wife herself, has power over her body. Confer 1 Corinthians 7:4. Reply to Objection 3. As stated above in question 122, Articles 1 and 4, the precepts of the Decalogue are universal principles of the divine law. Hence they need to be common precepts. Now, it was not possible to give any common affirmative precepts of temperance, because the practice of temperance varies according to different times, as Augustine remarks in On the Good of Marriage 15:7, and according to different human laws and customs. Second article. Whether the precepts of the virtues annexed to temperance are suitably given in the divine law. Objection 1. It would seem that the precepts of the virtues annexed to temperance are unsuitably given in the divine law. For the precepts of the Decalogue, as stated above in Article 1, third reply, are certain universal principles of the whole divine law. Now, pride is the beginning of all sin, according to Ecclesiasticus 10:15. Therefore, among the precepts of the Decalogue there should have been one forbidding pride. Objection 2 further. A place before all should have been given in the Decalogue to those precepts by which men are especially induced to fulfill the law, because these would seem to be the most important. Now, since humility subjects man to God, it would seem most of all to dispose man to the fulfillment of the divine law. Wherefore obedience is accounted one of the degrees of humility, as stated above in question 161, Article 6. And the same apparently applies to meekness, the effect of which is that a man does not contradict the divine scriptures, as Augustine observes, in On Christian Doctrine 2:7. Therefore, it seems that the Decalogue should have contained precepts of humility and meekness. Objection 3 further. It was stated in the foregoing article that adultery is forbidden in the Decalogue, because it is contrary to the love of our neighbor. But inordinateness of outward movements, which is contrary to modesty, is opposed to neighborly love. Wherefore Augustine says in his rule, "In all your movements let nothing be done to offend the eye of any person whatever." Therefore, it seems that this kind of inordinateness should have also been forbidden by a precept of the Decalogue. On the contrary, suffices the authority of Scripture. I answer that the virtues annexed to temperance may be considered in two ways. First, in themselves, secondly, in their effects. Considered in themselves, they have no direct connection with the love of God or of our neighbor. Rather do they regard a certain moderation of things pertaining to man himself. But considered in their effects, they may regard the love of God or of our neighbor, and in this respect the Decalogue contains precepts that relate to the prohibition of the effects of the vices opposed to the parts of temperance. Thus the effect of anger, which is opposed to meekness, is sometimes that a man goes on to commit murder, and this is forbidden in the Decalogue, and sometimes that he refuses due honor to his parents, which may also be the result of pride, which leads many to transgress the precepts of the first table. Reply to Objection 1. Pride is the beginning of sin, but it lies hidden in the heart, and its inordinateness is not perceived by all in common. Hence there was no place for its prohibition among the precepts of the Decalogue, which are like first self-evident principles. Reply to Objection 2. Those precepts which are essentially an inducement to the observance of the law presuppose the law to be already given, wherefore they cannot be first precepts of the law so as to have a place in the Decalogue. Reply to Objection 3. Inordinate outward movement is not injurious to one's neighbor if we consider the species of the act as are murder, adultery, and theft, which are forbidden in the Decalogue, but only as being signs of an inward inordinateness as stated above in question 168, Article 1, first and third replies. End of question 170. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. End of Summa Theologica Pars Secunda Secundae, Treatise on the Cardinal Virtues, Prudence, Justice, Fortitude, and Temperance.